Well, welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for our discussion today as we tackle contemporary issues that touch on theology and morality and biblical issues. We tackle issues in the culture. We try to have an interface between the secular, godless culture and the biblical Christian morality in the Bible and the theology of the Bible. So we're trying to do that today. We're talking about a book from the author, popular author. She was very popular in the 90s, and not so much right now because she hasn't written as prolifically as she had early in her career, but it is Anne Rice. And Anne Rice has had a journey out of atheism into Christianity. It's called Out of the Darkness. And this book came out, I would say, maybe about 5 to 10 years ago. But it really is interesting to see someone who lived most of their adult life as an atheist, as an un-God believer, a believer in nothingness, a believer in atheism, a believer in meaninglessness. And that's what she actually says. She believed that the world was meaningless, that there was no morality, that there was no God, and that she just had to do her best on earth in this lifetime, and that's what she believed. Now, she didn't start out as an atheist. She was raised Roman Catholic, this woman right here, sort of an eccentric, not only writer, but eccentric person herself, and here looks a little bit like some of her characters. The vampire theme was her big claim to fame, and she would write many vampire books. Now, personally, I never got into the vampire genre. I never was really a great vampire fan as far as fictional characters go. I know that there was a recent spat of books and movies about vampires centered around a woman who interacted with vampires, and that's part of this whole thing. Now, Anne Rice wrote about vampires long before the popularizing in the movies. For example, in most recent times, and I can't remember that series, but it was a very popular series that had a number of movies out with the vampire theme. And this author, her theme was constantly about vampires, and she explains in her spiritual biography that the vampire was sort of a person that she really identified with, because a vampire is someone who wanders through life in this godless, meaningless, purposeless world and is looking for meaning and purpose but finds none. And that's what this writer was saying was actually going on in her life when she wrote the vampire books. So you can look her up online, Google her, and find out all the books that she's written. I don't recommend the books because I've never written or read any of the books. The most famous one was the first one she wrote called Interview with a Vampire, and that then became a movie with Tom Cruise. And I think I might have seen that movie before, but it didn't leave any kind of impression with me. So I'm not sure. It must not have been that good. I didn't think it was that good of a movie as far as fiction, science fiction goes. And it didn't leave any real strong impressions in me. But that was her big book. And then it turned into a movie with Tom Cruise. So she was one of the most popular authors during the 90s and the early 2000s, probably earned millions and millions of dollars from that theme of the vampire and the different situations that different vampires would get into. And who would have known all along that she was, in fact, identifying with the vampire and looking for meaning and purpose in her atheism? Now, the book is very interesting because it's from someone who really doesn't talk in theological terms. This woman was really born and raised in New Orleans, around that area. And she was a Roman Catholic, and she went to church and did all the things the Catholic Church said to do at that time. and pretty much conformed to that culture, the Roman Catholic culture, the more traditionalist Roman Catholic culture. But it didn't really get into her own soul. She really wasn't converted, as you might say. As she was just going along because it was a cultural, cultural Christianity, and you see this in the South a lot in Protestantism with Baptists. A cultural Baptist, a cultural Protestant in the South is just typical. It's what every person is, pretty much, unless there's something radical like a Jew or a Catholic. They did have pockets of Catholics in the South, and one of the bastions of Catholicism was New Orleans because of just the historical incidences. The French settled that part of the area in the United States and brought Roman Catholicism there. So there was an enclave of Roman Catholicism in New Orleans and scattered about the South in different cities. And along the East Coast, for example, in Baltimore, there was a big grouping of Catholics in the early part of our country. And so these pockets of Catholicism flourished, but for the most part, the South was Baptist Christian and of a very Southern variety. And it became even more so during the time of the Civil War, where being part of the church in the South became part of your identity as a Southerner. So that's the way it is still today, in the sense that in the South, there's a lot of religiosity, and there's a lot of more traditionalist Christianity, I would say more biblical Christianity, actually, holding forth to the doctrines, and not as much modernism or updated or liberal or so-called progressive Christianity you would find in the mainline churches scattered about, say, New England and in the Midwest. So she was raised in a traditionalist Roman Catholic church, but when she became a teenager and began to grow up and went to college, she basically rejected that traditionalist Catholic upbringing, and she became more of a skeptic and then outright atheist after a while. So she was trying to explain the world in scientific worldview and scientific rational means. And so she rejected the Christianity of her childhood. Now, she began to wonder when she went to college, she began to see that a lot of the students in the secular environment in the colleges that she attended, here's something that she wrote. She said of the girls that were attending the college, it says that they negotiated their moral decisions with considerable thought, but without the guidance, it seemed, of any established church. So basically what she's saying is that she ran into her peers at this secular college, and they were basically negotiating morality on the fly. They basically made it up as they went along. Now, they had principles, but they weren't consistent, and they were basically their own self-constructed moral laws, which could be broken at any moment if they felt necessary. So they had principles, but they weren't formed around the Christian moral ethic and the Bible. So they were secular. And then she also writes, most of my new friends took sexual experiment rather casually. So part of their own ethics and morality was, for example, you couldn't cheat on your boyfriend and have sexual experiences with some other boy while you're going steady with one boy. So that might have been someone in the secular world's principle. But yet they had no problem with having sex before marriage and what the Bible calls fornicating, and having sexual experiences all over the place, and not any relationship to the Christian moral standards. And they did this very casually, and that's what she was noting. And she also noted here, she says they weren't tormented by notions of sin. So they didn't have the fear of God in them. So here is this girl, this young woman who goes off to college, and she had a form of Catholicism, a very traditional form of Catholicism that was more just a part of her culture, cultural Christianity, so that when she went into college, she really didn't have any firm convictions about it. It was just the way that she had been raised. And she ran into more worldly girls, more secular girls, who had no problem with breaking any of the sexual ethics of Christianity and basically made up their Christianity as they went, if they even had any kind of connection with the church. And I'm sure some of them did attend once in a while, Christmas and Easter, and were still considered Roman Catholic, but they would break any of the rules that the Roman Catholic Church had and didn't feel all that bad about it. So they had chucked or thrown out the fear of God for the consequences of sin. And they were living basically a consequence-free, guilt-free life, doing whatever they wanted to do. And she also talked about that there were drugs and alcohol and different things too that people were experimenting with. So there was a lot of experimentation. This was during the time that entering into the 60s and in that whole culture where you had a lot of experimentation going on. And even before the 60s, there was beginning the weakening of the moral standards and more of a more cultural Christianity. And she also writes, desperately I sought to escape the sense of sin that seemed to determine every choice facing me. I lost faith in hellfire. Or to put it differently, faith in hellfire simply did not hold me firmly as faith in God had once done. I left the church. So she didn't like the idea of hellfire. She didn't like the idea of judgment. She didn't like the idea of eternal punishment. And so these were doctrines that she quickly got rid of. And you can see why, because it's not a pleasant idea. And if you're going to make up your own morality, if you're going to go your own way and you're not going to follow God and you're not going to live according to his will, well, then why would you want to hold on to ideas that you don't like? You don't like the idea of hellfire. Well, you know what? The thing is, nobody likes the idea of hellfire. The people, the Christians who believe in the doctrine of hell, for example, myself, I believe it because the Bible teaches it. I believe it because Jesus taught it himself. He actually taught on more about hell than he did about heaven, if you can believe it. Just go through the Gospels and count the number of instances where he's talking about hell or warning people about hell, and then talk about the warning people, encouraging people to go to heaven. And you'll find that he speaks more about hell than he does heaven. Now that's the truth. But I don't believe in hell because I like the idea. I believe it because the Bible teaches it. So it's basically, I'm not willing to pick and choose as Anne Rice was in her college days. And then she says, the real tragedy, however, was I quit believing in God. So she stopped believing in some of these unpleasant doctrines, and then she gradually began to stop believing in God. And she says, I stopped really talking to God a long time ago. So she stopped praying. She stopped bringing her concerns, her issues, her troubles, her struggles, her frustrations. She stopped interacting with God on a regular basis, because people who really believe in God, who trust in Christ, who follow Jesus, they not only read their Bibles because they want to draw close to God through his word, but they also pray because they want to live their lives in connection with God. So if there's a decision that faces them as to, for example, where to work or where to live, or even daily decisions as to what to buy, what purchases to make, They go to God in prayer. It may not be a long prayer. If you're going to buy a car, for example, and you want to buy a good one, and you don't want to buy a lemon and get stuck with something that doesn't run or doesn't run very well, then you would naturally say, okay, God, help me in selecting the right car. I need to find transportation, and so on and so forth. You may not be praying on your knees every day for that, but you would offer up prayers in that respect, and all kinds of things in life that you would need God's guidance and wisdom for. And she also says, and let's see, rejection of his existence and a determination to face the world with a new courage which seemed right. So she felt empowered by her rejection of God, and she felt like she was now an adult. She was a grown-up. She didn't need the fairy tales and the little stories that she was told as a child. You can see that she never really inputted an adult serious faith. And again, churches sometimes are guilty of oversimplifying the Bible and the Christian faith to children and to teenagers even, especially to teenagers, thinking that if it gets too complicated, they will reject it. Well, that's the opposite. If they keep on feeding a sort of childlike theology to teenagers, especially older teens, then they're going to actually be hurting the teen later on, because it's very easy to reject a childlike theology. And that's what Anne Rice seems to be here saying. She said that she determined to face the world with new courage, because she was going to live by reason and rationality and the secular worldview. She says, the church, with all its rules about sex, the modern world, and books and matters of dogma, had become absolute proof to me that God didn't exist. So she was turned off by the answers that the church gave, and the dogmatic answers, the certain answers. And when you go to college, you definitely run into thinkers and authors and philosophers and academics who simply will criticize the Bible, criticize Christian answers, and say those are bad and we have better answers. And a lot of the students fall for that. And if they're not smart enough to argue back with the professor or debate a little bit, they are easily persuaded that the secular worldview, the atheistic, agnostic view of the academic world is superior, because all the professors tend to give that attitude that the secular worldview is better than Christianity. And she also writes, to gloss over the failings and the corruption of the church, many Catholics are willing to gloss over the failings and corruptions of the church. But she said, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to be critical of the church and criticize the church and not be afraid to say they're wrong. And we see this today all the time among Catholics, especially. Catholicism comes as a dogmatic system. It says that it's an infallible system. And for example, when the Pope speaks, you're supposed to obey him. You're supposed to listen to him. And what happened during the 60s was that, for example, on the issue of birth control, the Pope came out with an encyclical that said that birth control was prohibited. Now, here's what happened in the Catholic population. Most Catholics ignored him. So you have a lot of these issues in the Roman Catholic Church. In the Protestant Church, there is no Pope. He's not speaking ex cathedra. He's not speaking dogmatically. There are pastors who will make arguments from the Bible, but it's a different situation in the Roman Catholic Church. So there's a lot of rebellion, a lot of resentment, a lot of hard feelings in the Roman Catholic Church, because it's almost like it's all or one. You have to accept everything they say. You have to accept that the Pope is speaking for God in everything, or you have to reject it, and she rejected it. The teachers of the modern world who had long ago rejected God, she joined the academic community there in her college and the milieu of the academy, and she joined them and rejected the Christian faith that she grew up with. Okay, she also writes, after a few months of dismal grieving for my faith, I began to find a new relaxation and a new passion for life, but I felt a certain bitter darkness too. The world without God was a world in which everything or anything might happen, and there would never be justice for the millions who died at the hands of tyrants or the poor who had suffered the neglected parts in the world. So she writes, but I felt a certain bitter darkness too. So she gave up God and she rejected Christianity, but then she also felt that she had entered into a darkness. And now that was the impetus for her books about the vampire. Because again, the vampire is this lone figure walking through the world of the undead, you might say, and that looking for meaning where there isn't meaning. And that was her life in her atheism. And she writes about atheism that, in fact, being an atheist required discipline very like that of being a Catholic. So you had to hold to your atheism at times when you're tempted to believe in God, because there are things that you see from an atheistic standpoint that would draw you to God in life. And she said, and I took from these works, the atheistic authors, Camus' urgent faith that we live a moral and responsible life, even if nothing is known about how we got here or where we're going, that we make the meaning, that we stand for values which we can't deny. So she's trying to grapple with the fact that under the atheistic worldview, everything is meaningless and life is absurd, but yet she wants meaning and she doesn't want life to be absurd from the atheistic perspective. So she also had married a man who was an atheist, and so they basically brought up a family of atheists. Her son was raised in an atheist family. And so she felt that she was free to explore and research the answers to her own questions without input from God. And so she also found that she had a belief that you could be secular and still go through life and succeed. She felt like respectable men and women lived together out of wedlock, no fault divorce came into existence, and that you could basically create your own morality and live by it. And she saw society changing in that direction as she grew up. And she says, around me, even or as ever, more good people. There were good people, conscientious people, secular people who had, on principle, wanted to make our world a better place. And so they had ideals, but they were coming at it from a totally godless, atheistic perspective. And so one of the problems that developed in their family was that they began to drink heavily. And they didn't go to AA, but when they had their child, their son, they began to realize that they had better reform themselves, and so they stopped their heavy drinking. She said, I poured out the darkness and despair of an atheistic struggling to establish bonds and hopes in a godless world where everything might and could happen, where happiness could be torn away in one moment, a world in which the condemned and the despised raise their voices in protest and song. So she was beginning to feel that this atheism could not work. And so eventually she began to seek out symbols of Christianity. When she visited Europe, she would she wanted to go to these churches, these famous churches, like in France, the couple of these great, huge cathedrals. She wanted to visit them just to be in the beauty of these churches. She'd go to, for example, she went to Brazil to see the statue of Jesus over the cities there, a city there in Brazil, the famous, huge 150-foot statue of Jesus. And that inspired her. And she collected statues, church symbols, and she began to realize that the longings in her heart could only be filled by God and the Christian faith. And so eventually she did reconvert back to Christianity, only this time with an adult faith, and this time, consciously, deliberately aware of the alternatives. And that's where she gets her called out of darkness. The darkness with atheism, the hopeless despair, depression that produces in a person's life. And basically she converted to Christianity because that was where her heart was drawing her. It wasn't an argument, apologetics argument, that drew her to Christianity. She just felt that God loved her and cared for her and wanted her to experience his love. And she felt that God was speaking to her through Jesus Christ. The person of Jesus was opening up a window to heaven for her, and that she had to yield her life, surrender her life to Jesus in order to experience the kind of life that she was longing for, that atheism would never give her in its darkness. And so she also was very attracted by the fact that the Jewish people had survived for so long, and against all odds, the small Jewish population had survived against so many enemies, and that it had to be God and God alone that explains their tenacious survival. And the more she read of history and how God was working things out in history, now she says that there are all kinds of problems and questions that she doesn't have answers for, but yet she feels that here she said, the world of atheism was cracking apart for me, just as once the world of Catholic faith had cracked apart. I was losing my faith in the non-existence of God. So she deconverted from atheism, you might call it. And it was basically because she felt that atheism was an absurd position and it offered nothing in life. And it's very interesting. I would encourage anyone to read Called Out of Darkness by Anne Rice. There are encouraging signs that people are turning to Christianity. People you wouldn't think would turn to Christianity are turning because God is calling them out of darkness and into the light. Well, I hope that's been a helpful commentary. We'll see you back next week on another program. God bless.